resistance. The next study will reveal the results of a large phase 3 clinical trial comparing a new oral drug, imatinib, to standard chemotherapy first line in patients who have lung adenocarcinoma harboring the EGFR mutation. And this will be presented by Dr. James Yang, who is professor and director of cancer research at the National Taiwan University in Taipei, Taiwan.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's my great pleasure and honor to present the data of this randomized phase 3 study. Non-small cell lung cancer is a major disease worldwide, and we know that the most useful treatment for these patients for metastatic disease is still chemotherapy. But over the years, in the past several randomized studies, we know that there's a specific group of patients, they have a specific mutation in the molecule, we call it epidermal growth factor receptor. So patients who has the EGFR mutations had been treated with reversible EGFR tyrosine kinase inhibitors, namely gefitinib or erlotinib, and was compared to combination chemotherapy in 5 randomized studies. In those 5 randomized studies, we have shown that patients receiving erlotinib or gefitinib had better progression-free survival time compared with combination chemotherapy. Now, today, we are going to discuss another compound that is afatinib. Afatinib is an irreversible EGFR inhibitor. It is different from gefitinib or erlotinib in 3 aspects. First, it is irreversible. That is, when it binds to EGFR, it does not fail off. Therefore, the inhibition was stronger by hypothesis. And secondly, afatinib is a pan-HER blocker, meaning that it not only inhibits EGFR, it also inhibits HER2, HER3, and HER4 dimerization. And in the previous in vitro study, people have shown that afatinib has the in vitro activity against EGFR-resistant mutation T790M. Thus, we embark on this randomized phase 3 study in patients with lung adenocarcinoma without any prior EGFR TKI or chemotherapy. So this is a study design. Patient must have EGFR mutation detected in one of the 3 central laboratories using a standard kit and standard methodology, a very sensitive allele-specific polymerase chain reaction. And once proven EGFR mutation positive and checking all the eligibility criteria, they were randomized 2-to-1 to afatinib 40 milligram per day continuous until disease progression or until the tumor begin to regrow, and or to combination chemotherapy cisplatin pemetrexed with a standard dose up to 6 cycles. The chemotherapy that was chosen as a comparator is currently regarded as the most standard chemotherapy for lung adenocarcinoma, and that this chemotherapy regimen was not tested in the 5 randomized studies that I mentioned to you. Total of 345 patients were accrued out of 1,269 patients who had their tumor tested, and 230 to afatinib arm and 115 to chemotherapy arm. The primary endpoint of this study was progression-free survival time determined by independent reviewers. The secondary endpoint are listed here that include overall response rate, disease control, overall survival, tumor shrinkage, quality of life, and safety. This slide shows you the curves of progression-free survival time. This is the overall population. All 345 patients here shows that the blue line is afatinib, the red line is chemotherapy. The study has met its primary endpoint by showing that afatinib was better than combination chemotherapy in terms of progression-free survival time read by independent review. The median progression-free survival time for patients who received afatinib was 11.1 months, and for patients who received chemotherapy was 6.9 months. And this was superior to most of the previous randomized studies. The hazard ratio is 0.58. highly statistically significant. If you look at the 12 months here, this is another way to look at these curves. You can see that 47% of the patients who receive afatinib did not progress versus 22% of the patients who receive chemotherapy did not progress. And the other side of the graph, I have shown to you the patient with so-called common mutations. Patients who had EGFR mutation are divided to several types of mutations. 90% of them had one of these common mutations, deletion in exon 19 and one point mutation in exon 21. So out of these 90% of patients from all these 345, that is 308 patients, the progression-free survival time for patients who receive afatinib was even better at 13.6%, and for chemotherapy was the same at 6.9%. Hazard ratio 0.47, highly statistically significant. As you look at the 12 months here, 51% of the patients did not progress who received afatinib, and they had one of those common mutations. So we're not only measuring the progression time, we also measure other endpoints such as tumor shrinkage. The patient who received afatinib had better tumor shrinkage compared to a patient who received chemotherapy. The response rate for patient who received afatinib was 56% by independent review and was 23% by chemotherapy. And the disease control was even better at 90% versus 81% in chemotherapy. We also measured patients' quality of life with a standard questionnaire, EORTC, and patients who received afatinib actually had better quality of life compared with chemotherapy in the overall health status and all 5 major domains that was measured. We also collect patients' lung cancer-related symptoms carefully, and for cough and this is shortness of breath, you can see that patients who receive afatinib had a longer time to worsening of their lung cancer-related symptoms, cough and dyspnea, as compared to chemotherapy, as shown here in the red line. Afatinib and chemotherapy had side effects, and these side effects are expected from the prior EGFR inhibition experience. So a patient who received afatinib had more patients with diarrhea, skin rash, stomatitis, paronychia, dry skin, whereas patient who received chemotherapy had the nausea, vomiting, fatigue, hematologic toxicities expected. About 15% of them had somewhat severe diarrhea, skin rash. However, only 8% of them that led to discontinuation, and only very small amount of them had a side effect that led to discontinuation in the afatinib arm. For diarrhea, only 1.3%. So in summary, LUXON-3 is the largest and most robust phase 3 study in EGFR mutation positive patient, and this is meant for a registration study worldwide. It is a true global study that was performed in Asia, Europe, North America, South America, and Australia. The primary endpoint was met. In all patients, the progression-free survival time of 11.1 months for afatinib and 6.9 months for chemotherapy was detected. And for patients who had common mutation, the number was even better at 13.6 months. We also shown that patients who received afatinib had better tumor shrinkage, longer control disease, better quality of life, and better symptom control compared with chemotherapy. The adverse events that was detected with afatinib was consistent with prior EGFR inhibitors and was consistent with our prior phase 2 studies that mainly consist of diarrhea, skin rash that were manageable and predictable and reversible. Thank you for your attention.